Thank you everyone for coming to tonight's event. The IOP is proud to welcome former ambassador to the Russian Federation and one of our nation's leading experts on Russia, Michael McFaul, to campus for this discussion. Born in Montana, Ambassador McFaul went on to attend Stanford University, where he quickly began to develop an expertise in foreign policy and Russian studies. As a student, he spent time in the Soviet Union and graduated with a bachelor's degree in international relations and Slavic languages, as well as with a master's degree in Slavic and Eastern European studies. From Stanford, he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, where he earned his PhD in international relations. In 1995, he returned to Stanford as a professor of political science. In 2009, Ambassador McFaul transitioned from academia to government, joining President Obama's administration as a special assistant to the president and senior director of Russia and Eurasian affairs for the National Security Council. From there, he went on to become the American ambassador to the Russian Federation, a post in which he served from 2012 to 2014. Since his days in government, Ambassador McFaul has returned to Stanford, now serving as the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He continues to offer his expert perspective on Russia as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, NBC analyst, author of several books, and as a columnist in the Washington Post. Today's event will focus on his new book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, in which he offers an inside perspective of U.S.-Russia relations, particularly how this key relationship has changed over time. With accusations of Russian interference in the 2016 election and lingering uncertainties about the relationship between members of the Trump campaign and Russian officials, today's conversation could not be more topical. Julia Yaffe, a contributing writer at The Atlantic covering national security and foreign policy topics, will moderate tonight's conversation. A Russian immigrant, Yaffe went on to study Soviet history at Princeton and earned a Fulbright to return to Moscow. Throughout her career, she has written extensively about Russian politics, and the IOP is happy to welcome her perspective to this event. Without further ado, please welcome Julia Yaffe and Ambassador Michael McFaul.
Oh, all right, and to you.
Thank you.
So thank you to the Institute of Politics and University of Chicago for having us, and thank you for inviting me to this. Ambassador McFaul, I have known for quite a while, and you were the best ambassador to Moscow ever. Because you had these off-the-record briefings for journalists at Spasa
So that I
House.
could learn what was going on in Russia, by the way. It was
But we learned a lot
from
too.
them.
And I just remember the press attaches from the U.S. Embassy sitting there and just kind of fainting, and and just having panic attacks in the corners. But they were just such amazing conversations and insights into.
Those were fun times.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's get started.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here too.
No, my pleasure. And this book is excellent and super timely, but I think, and it goes a long way to answering this question, but I wanted to ask you now for the audience anyway, but what happened? I mean, no, really, because I was there during the reset. I was based in Moscow. You were the architect of the reset. We talked when you were at the White House. And then it all just kind of fell apart, and now we're here. What happened?
Well, the book, there's kind of three stories in one in the book, right? So this is one of them, which is the Obama period, right? What happened to that arc? And that's the one that's most important to me, and I'll answer it in a minute. But there's also the arc of U.S.-Russian relations over the post-Cold War era, which also had some good times in the early 90s. That also ends, I think, in when the reset ends, that ends. And then there's the arc of me personally, and a similar kind of thing. But let's start with Obama. To me, it's pretty simple. The reset began with a concept that also I think was pretty simple, which is we came in January 2009. I started the first day. I actually started the day after the president. The president was sworn in. That was his day, first day on the job. I came there the next day and was there for 3 years working with him. Incredible experience, honor of a lifetime to work for him, by the way. And being here and seeing David today, earlier today, a lot of nostalgia about the good old days. Good old days, right? They were pretty good days, those days. At least for me, they were. And the idea was quite simple. Let's not get hung up on baggage from the Cold War or personality stuff or cultural things. Let's just try to find interests that are in common and achieve what President Obama used to call win-win outcomes. And for a while there, we got a bunch of them done. We got nuclear weapons. We got a New START treaty, 2010, reducing weapons by 30% in the world between the United States and Russia. That's a pretty big deal. Vice President would add an adjective to that that begins with F that I'm not comfortable saying. And I say that in part because I want to remind you all how hard it is to do anything in government. Most of government work is just being. Just spinning your wheels. And by the way, a lot of being ambassador was that. But in 2010, that was a big thing. We got something done. And we got Iran sanctions that led to what I think was a great deal, the P5+1 Iran nuclear deal. And tragically, the president tore that up. We got a new supply route to Afghanistan, to reducing our dependence on Pakistan so that we could take the war to Pakistan against Osama bin Laden. And without that, that operation would have been a lot harder to do. I actually was in with the president the day before that operation to do one more enhancement to the northern distribution network. It was a call to Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan because we were worried that they were going to cut off our supply rights, right? And never did we make the goal good relations. We never, at least not me, never in any of the documents when they're released, you're not going to find the goal of the reset is good relations with Russia. It was always concrete outcomes that we think then would make us better off. And I could go through a long list on the economic side. We'll save that for later, or we'll save it for the book. And another thing that people forget, back at the peak of the reset, 60% of Russians had a favorable view of the United States, and almost as many Americans had a favorable view of Russia. That was 2010. Two events, I think, end the reset. And they're both events that happened in Russia, not in terms of our policy. We didn't change our policy. Maybe we should have changed it earlier, by the way. We'll get into our mistakes later. But I think two things are most important. One, and you know this history well because you were writing about it. We were learning about it by the Moscow Press Corps, by the way, in 2012 when it was pretty kick-ass group.
Yeah, it was.
And I've seen some of your colleagues on this book tour here and there. Pretty amazing group. But two things. One, Putin decides he's coming back. September, he decides he wants to run for president. In the March election, March 2012. And, you know, in retrospect, everybody says Medvedev didn't matter. He was a puppet. By the way, that was our analysis too. I got to tell you honestly, Putin's the big dog, the big decision maker. But what we got to learn, tragically, is that actually Putin had different views than, Medvedev had different views than Putin about a lot of big things. Most certainly about Libya, he had a very different view. He acquiesced and abstained on the resolutions that allowed military force. That had never happened in Soviet or Russian history. He did that. Putin later criticized him, as you may remember, for drinking he didn't say this, but what he meant was drinking the Kool-Aid of reset and being too enamored with, you know, Barak and all that stuff. But
he called it a crusade, too.
And he called it a crusade. I'm glad you remember that. It was pretty tough language. Mm-hmm. But what we noticed over time was that Putin had a very different view. World zero-sum for Putin, not win-win. And most importantly, that gets to the second variable, second factor. Putin, for many years, has seen the United States use overt and covert power to overthrow regimes. And let's just be clear, there's a lot of empirical data to support that hypothesis about American foreign policy. We've done that for decades from time to time. And Obama, when we first met with him, July 2009, out at Putin's dacha, he said, well, we're different. I'm different. He went into this long tirade about how stupid the Iraq war was. Prime Minister Putin did that. And at the end of it, Obama said, you're right. I totally agree with you. I actually was against that war long before it was popular to be against that war. And so I think for a while he thought, well, maybe this guy is different. Maybe he's going to behave differently. But then first the Arab Spring happens. And for Putin, we're behind that all.
That's right.
But then the big thing, and you know more about this than I do, demonstrations in Russia, where Parliamentary election was falsified. We met, talked about it in the Situation Room, kind of normal rates for Russia, no big deal. But this time around, it was a big deal for people. Again, Julia knows these people better than I do because she was reporting at the time on them and writing about them. And they then had new technology. They had smartphones, and they had Vkontakte and Facebook and Twitter, and first 50, then 200, and then tens of thousands of people demonstrating on the streets. And that event was the end of the reset because he blamed us for those protesters. He blamed America, he blamed Secretary Clinton by name, and he blamed me by name. And I think no matter how we tried to convince him, we met with him from time to time, but for him, we were out to get him, and he needed us to be an enemy to mobilize his base inside Russia and to marginalize the opposition. And that, to me, those two factors, Putin back and the opposition. So if Volodya's still here, are you still here, Volodya? He's off to the theater. It's Russians, it's crazy Democrats that ended the reset, and crazy Democrats in Egypt and later in Ukraine. Not us, but to be clear, Putin's reaction to those demonstrations.
So I just want to ask you a follow-up about that. When he blamed Secretary Clinton and he blamed you, to what extent did he believe himself when he was saying this? Was it just cynical kind of rally around my flag and it's an enemy invasion?
Yes.
Or did he really believe that you were there to foment revolution?
I'm smiling because President Obama used to ask me that question all the time. Exactly the same question.
Hey,
it's the fundamental question in many ways, right? And my own thinking on it, and I try to relay the evolution of my thinking in the book, has changed. Because initially, I thought it was strictly instrumental. In fact, I know a lot of Putin people. People are surprised by that. He and I are not Facebook friends, right? Although maybe we are, who knows? Maybe he's trolling me all night long. I think I'm talking to Ivan, and it's really President Putin. To the best of my knowledge, we're not Facebook friends. But a thing that will be surprising to people who have only read the cartoonized version of me and my time as ambassador is I knew a lot of these people. Some of them I'd known for 25 years. And one of them, who I knew pretty well at the time, a guy named Surkov, who you know, involved in campaigns, involved in creating Putinism, sometimes called managed democracy, other times called sovereign democracy. And I went to see him early on in my tenure as ambassador. The presidential election is still happening. And he said to me, Mike, you were manna from heaven. Thank goodness you came when you did. Because you're the typical American, you've been involved with all these writing about revolution, and we're going to cut and paste what he didn't say this, but they did. They'll take out the word not from some of my Journal of Democracy pieces to make it sound like I'm there to overthrow the regime, and it's going to be good for the campaign. He said, don't worry about it, be relaxed, we'll win the election, everything will settle down. By the way, Medvedev said the same thing to me, now that I think about it. Medvedev, when I gave my credentials, and there's photos to record it, he pulled me aside. You present your credentials in their system with 5 or 6 other ambassadors. By the way, they do it in a much bigger way. It's in the Kremlin, trumpets are blaring, you walk up and hand your paper, and then you drink champagne. The way we do it at the White House, you're sitting in the little vestibule in this very skromny, this very modest room called the West Wing. You come in for 2 minutes, you hand the paper, and then you're out. The Russians, they do some things well, better than us. And he did pull me aside. He said, don't take this stuff personal. We'll get on to other things after the election. Fast forward to later, I do think he thinks it's real because he's just so paranoid. The guy's paranoid. He assigns power to the CIA that the CIA does not have. I've heard him talk, usually talking to the president, President Obama or somebody else. And don't get me wrong, the CIA is powerful, okay? A former colleague of mine from the White House was running the CIA when I was ambassador, John Brennan. They have tremendous capabilities, but not nearly as much agency as Putin assigns to them. That's number one. He thinks that they can do all these secret things that they're just not capable of doing. And then another thing, we do threaten him. Let's be honest. Democratic, open societies, that's threatening to the way he rolls. A Russian friend of mine said this to me one day. He said, Mike, when you're tweeting about what your children are doing, that's an indirect threat to Putin, because he's not telling you what his children are doing. And being an open society and supporting democratic values, those, in a more abstract way, is a threat to the way his regime is run, and therefore those kinds of things would be threatening to him. So were we handing out money to Navalny in little packets to foment revolution? Absolutely not. That's absurd. But were we, in some abstract sense, trying to stand up for democracy and human rights? The answer to that is yes. And in Putin's world, that means that that's threatening.
And we were
to
happy
him.
to see these protests.
Yes, I think that's fair.
You write about it in your book. You remembered the late 80s, early 90s, and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Back when I'd seen these before,
Right.
and some of the same people were involved,
That's right.
Now, publicly, we took some way circuitous routes with the entourage to avoid any demonstrators. I didn't show up and hand out cookies and none of that. I watched it on Doge TV, at Spaso House. I was far away. And they have grossly exaggerated all these meetings I had with the opposition. The famous meeting that I allegedly had when I first showed up was actually not even my meeting. It was a meeting with the Deputy Secretary, Bill Burns is his name. My job as ambassador is to sit there with my hands planted and listen. That's what you do a lot in that job, by the way. And Alexei Navalny, the guy that evidently was my best friend in life, I never met with once as the ambassador, not once. The one time we were together, it was a 20th anniversary of the Moscow Times. Were you there by chance? Maybe, maybe not?
No.
And I remember he walked in and he saw me and I saw him and I put my head down because I knew the cameras were going to be trying to get us together, and they did for 1 minute. That was the extent of my contact with Mr. Navalny at that time.
So the other fascinating thing about your book is that it's not just about the time period, as you said, it's not just about the Obama presidency and your role at the National Security Council and as ambassador. You've had a front row seat to the post-Soviet, the entirety of the post-Soviet period.
And even Soviet.
And right, well,
Yeah,
I count it as one thing. So, and I asked this of the new Russian ambassador to Washington at a recent dinner. So, but I'm going to ask you, and then I'll tell you what his response was.
Okay.
But do you think, it's easy to say, well, they did this and they did that.
Yeah.
What mistakes did we make?
Yeah.
What mistakes did the U.S. make? What could the U.S. have done better?
Right.
From, let's say, like 85 on.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, the book's 500 pages on purpose, because these are questions that are not always easily answered on Twitter or on a soundbite on TV.
Panel is perfect, though.
And don't get scared. 50 pages are footnotes, because I'm an academic. So buy the book. At Father's Day,
It reads
coming.
really well.
Well, thanks.
It's a quick read.
Coming from you, that's a big, because you're a real writer, an incredible writer. That means a lot to me that you said that. So the first thing I want to remind you of, from my point of view, as somebody who was living in the Soviet Union in its final days, including my Fulbright year was 1990-91, we, the United States, did not win the Cold War. We, together with Russians, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, but also the 300,000 people that are on the streets, and one of the photo in the book, that, for me at the time, that was a collective victory. They wanted to be part of the West and democracy, and in my view, they did the heavy lifting. We didn't do much. They stood down the tanks in August 1991. We didn't do that. They did that. And I think one of the mistakes we made was not framing it that way. thinking that we had won and this was a big victory for America. No, it was a common victory, and for my friends, most certainly at the time, it felt like a victory together. So that's the first thing. Second thing, I'm going to get to NATO and all that stuff, but I think that's trivial compared to this other stuff. We then thought that history had ended, right? Frank Fukuyama wrote that all countries were going to become liberal democracies. It was just a question of time, right? They're on a bumpy road, but they're going to get to nirvana just like we're already there. They're going to get there. And even China back then, we were writing, oh, they're going to get there. Well, that turned out to be a false analytic frame, right? It turns out a lot harder. And now it's not clear that liberal democracy is the endpoint of history. Related to that was, therefore, we did not lean in my view, enough to help with this, what I call a triple transformation. It wasn't just a transition to democracy. By the way, the word transition is too small, too. Transformation, revolution, big disjunctures. That's what was going on when I was living there. It wasn't just a transition. You know, we're going to do, now we've transited. It wasn't that. It was a triple transformation from autocracy to democracy, command economy to capitalism, and empire to independent nation state, all at the same time. It wasn't sequence. Right. Huge, huge undertaking that anybody would have struggled with. You know, Yegor Gaidar, Boris Yeltsin, no matter who you were, that would have been a difficult thing to do. And we didn't do a Marshall Plan. We didn't provide the resources.
Should we have?
I think we should have, yeah. And not just a Marshall Plan, but a lot of money for civics education and rule of law and democracy. The lion's share of what we did was for like privatization, not for democratization. And the reason we didn't, you know, I was living there and I write about it, is because unlike in World War II, there wasn't an enemy of the United States to Russia's east. We didn't do the Marshall Plan just out of the goodness of our hearts. We did it because we were worried that the Soviets were going to take over Germany and France and the rest of Europe. And that's why we leaned in then. You know, it's too bad that China was not rising at a faster rate back then. Maybe we would have had that argument. And then remember one other piece, just because I was talking to Axelrod about this. There are these things called presidential elections that pop up every 4 years in our country. And tragically, the first year of Russian independence was an election year, 1992, where the challenger in that election was saying, it's the economy, stupid, a paraphrase of Make America First. Governor Clinton, that he was attacking George H.W. Bush for spending too much time focused on foreign policy, and it was that was the drum of 1992. He later reverses himself, but by the time he does, it's too late. You know, the reformers are already out of the government. Sharon Mearden's back. So I think of the biggest mistakes, that one lingers bigger than the rest. The other ones, NATO expansion, bombing of Serbia, Iraq.
Should we have just dismantled NATO, though? What did we need it for if the Soviet Union was gone?
Well, no, I wouldn't have said that. My view was, let's expand NATO all the way to Russia. That was what I wrote, perhaps naively. I remember I wrote that article one time with a Russian colleague of mine, because there were no other security institutions. So if Europe whole and free, that to me includes at least St. Petersburg and probably Moscow. I remember when I went as a kid for the first time abroad to Leningrad, 1983, country bumpkin from Montana, and somehow it's east and west, and they're the communists and we're the outside. And when I landed in St. Petersburg, it felt pretty European to me, and I felt pretty backwards as a guy coming from California. But I say that because what's the argument? You got to remember back then. Today, of course not. It was a joke today. But back then, if you're bringing in countries that are more democratic and trying to join Europe, what's the argument that should stop at least before you get to the Euros? But I want to add a big but, because there's an important part of the argument in my book. Whether you agree with NATO expansion or not, we can debate that. I'm happy to in questions. Whether you think it was right to bomb Serbia or not in 1999 to stop genocide in Kosovo, we can debate that. I think it was the right decision. Whether you agree or not it was right to go into Iraq, I think that was a mistake. All of those events created tensions in U.S.-Russian relations. They did, under Yeltsin and Putin. All those things are true. But after all of them, the reset happened. And all the things we described earlier happened. So you can't say our conflict today is because of NATO expansion when in the between we had this period of cooperation. You don't get an A in my class using your regressions with your independent and dependent variables with that kind of argument. That is just, that is a violation of the way we teach causal inference at Stanford, and I suspect here at Chicago too. Kostya, you can tell me if that's true. I have done some regressions in my time. That's Professor Sonnen, just so who really, who does regressions in a very scientific way. I used to dabble. But the point is that's revisionist history. That's Putin pulling things from the past to say this happened then. And let me tell you about NATO expansion. When I was at the White House, I was on every single meeting with Putin and Medvedev, on every single phone call with those two gentlemen, with Barack Obama, with President Obama. Not once did a complaint about NATO expansion come up. It was a dead issue. Same when I was ambassador. I missed one summit with Putin in Northern Ireland, but I was at all the other meetings. Not once did it come up then. And the reason is, in fact, the one summit that I was at, the NATO summit I was at, in Lisbon, don't believe me, go look at what Medvedev said. He was there too. And at the Lisbon summit of NATO, he talked about how we had turned a corner. We were cooperating. And back then, it sounds silly to think about now, we were discussing missile defense cooperation at a NATO summit with the Russian president. That was 2010. And our critics would say, well, yeah, that's your mistake that you weren't expanding NATO. But by the time we showed up in January 2009, that issue was dead. It was dead with Georgia. It was dead with Ukraine. It was dead in the alliance. It wasn't dead in Tbilisi. They were still pushing for it, but it was dead in Kiev. It only reinvigorates itself after Russia uses force, in Ukraine.
So do you want to know what Antonov said?
Yes.
This is the new Russian ambassador.
Yes.
He said our mistake, the Russians' mistake was that we were too open.
Yes, I've heard him say that. Yes, we were too open. We were too soft.
Yeah, we cared too much and worked too hard.
Yes.
So
I did a lot of business with that guy. Anyway.
So a mutual friend of ours, also a writer, Michael Eidoff, wrote in his new book, and when we talked about it, he said, look, at this point, if you look at the last 100 years of Russian history, you have 3 examples. That's basically enough for a New York Times trend story. Russians tend to, the 90s were a small blip, and the Russians tend to prefer autocratic bureaucracies or bureaucratic autocracies.
Right.
And democracy is just not natural for them.
Yeah.
Can you imagine Russia? I mean, sure, you can imagine Russia as a democracy, but do you think it'll ever happen? Is it something that Russians are cut out for?
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple things about that. First of all, the blip that he's describing was actually 10 or 15 years, and it didn't feel like a blip to me. 300,000 people on the streets of Moscow every other week. Think about that. We've never seen that kind of mobilization in our country for 50 years. The idea that somehow, and they're all Russians, by the way. I was there. They weren't all Russians. There were some Ukrainians and Georgians and Lithuanians, but the majority were Russians. And then 2011, 2012, maybe that was a little more of a blip. But you've got to account for those blips in your theory. Why did that happen? You have to account for both. You can't just say it's all been smooth. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say, without question, some of the cultural inheritance, the church, 70 years of communism, those institutional legacies creates the ability for autocracy to linger and to revisit itself, right? And some of the mistakes of the 90s was not dismantling some of those autocratic institutions more robustly, including, by the way, the KGB. In an academic article I just wrote recently, I talk about that. Those are some mistakes there. And so it's easier to resurrect autocracy on the basis of that. But in the long run, I would just remind you that if you go back, and I've done this research for earlier research, or book I did, 70 years ago, you'd find a lot of books talking about Japanese culture has a proclivity towards autocracy. Germans, they're Nazis. They love autocracy. My grandfather, Irish-American guy, there was a time in his life when he would not bowl with Germans because they were autocrats. He later married a German, and it all worked out. But he used to tell that story because they're not
Was
Democrat.
she a kitchen Nazi? Sorry.
I don't know the history there, so that kind of argument looks pretty silly, right? 40 years ago, one of my colleagues at Stanford, but it was a big theory, it wasn't just at Stanford, maybe 50 years ago by now, there was a big theory out there that Catholics love autocrats. Because we have a pope, I'm culturally Catholic. I don't think I'm religiously Catholic anymore, but I'm definitely culturally Catholic. And we love the strong hand. The pope is more important than this other thing. And that theory was popular when most Catholic countries in the world were ruled by autocrats, Latin America and Southern Europe. That theory looks pretty stupid today. And if you were always, think about this. There was a time in European history when all Europeans were ruled by autocrats. So why didn't it all just keep going? So I'm suspicious of these deterministic cultural stories, which I want to be clear. It's not to say that these these institutional legacies don't help people like Putin, but I don't think it's inevitable that it's ruled that way. And then the other thing I say, and I tease this out in the book on counterfactuals, I want to remind you, Putin was a total accident of history. Yep. There was not mass demand for Putin to become president in 2000. That's complete, utter nonsense, otherwise known as propaganda. He was picked out of obscurity in August 1999. Back in August 1999, when he first became prime minister, his recognition rating, not his upside or downside, his recognition rating was 9%. Most Russians had never heard of him, never seen him. And the story that leads to that has to do with the financial crash in August 1998, which, by the way, begins in Korea. It doesn't begin in Russia. And before then, the heir apparent was another guy, Boris Nemtsov, picked by Yeltsin to be his heir apparent, brought back from Nizhny Novgorod to be the first deputy prime minister. By the way, a little footnote on Boris, he was a friend of mine before being assassinated. He won re-election in the middle of economic depression in Nizhny Novgorod, right, a provincial city, at a very chaotic time, and proudly of Jewish descent. So all of this notion that these things that Russia's this way, you've got to explain that to me, because Russians voted for him, okay, not somebody else. He was picked, and then August happens, and the government has to be dissolved, and that's how Putin gets picked. And had Nemtsov been picked in 2000, I think the story would have been very different.
Yeah. What do you think happens after Putin? Because he's not immortal, I think, unfortunately for him. What happens when he's gone? Well,
the honest answer is I don't know. And anybody who says they know, be careful believing them, okay? I would say both political science and the intelligence community, I dealt with them up close and personal for 5 years, are horrible at these kinds of things. I saw it many, many times. Green Revolution in Iran 2009, don't believe a single soul that predicted that. Arab Spring 2011, don't believe anybody. December 2011, nobody predicted that. Ukraine, November 2013, when this crazy guy, Mustafa Naim, says, I want to be part of Europe. If you agree with me, come out on the streets. Nobody was predicting that. And just Armenia, just, recently, like, I dare, maybe we're at Chicago, there's a lot of learned people here, so maybe somebody here predicted that. Email me the article, or even better, put it on Twitter so I can advertise it. But I haven't seen the article yet that was predicting that. So A, we're just bad at that, right? So that's my preambular statement to say what I think might happen. So one, you're right. Let's make a bold prediction. Putin will not rule Russia forever. I think we can agree on that.
Yes.
Going out on a limb there. I think he will rule for a while, however, because I think he's got a pretty sophisticated system in place. And I don't see that falling apart anytime soon. I know others disagree with me on that, and part of this is because maybe people don't know this. We were just talking about it. I wrote my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, not about Russia, but about Southern Africa and the regimes that became independent, Zimbabwe and Angola, and under much more dire economic circumstances, autocrats held on there for a long, long time, Dos Santos and Mugabe. So maybe that skews the way I look at these things. But once Putin steps down or is incapacitated, I don't see the institutional scaffolding for Putinism to survive very much longer. It's built on one guy. It's built on corruption. There's not a political party. There's not a succession plan. And so I think it crumbles pretty quickly. And then I think there's a big fight. I think there's a fight between the more pro-Western people. By the way, many of them are in the government and business. And I think you might be surprised at that. I used to meet them all the time. People that don't like the course that Putin has pushed them on. And they're waiting for this moment to come in a more evolutionary way. But then there are those that their property rights are tied up to Putin. And they're going to fight to hold on to those. And so I can't predict where it'll end, but I do think it'll be probably pretty volatile.
Okay. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. Again, remember to ask a question, not a statement. And the first 3 questions go to students, so keep that in mind.
Chicago traditions.
All right, well, thank you for being here. Full disclosure, I'm in Professor Mearsheimer's seminar class, so I have to ask a question.
I already know. He's wrong. No,
That's what I was expecting you to say.
But he's a really great teacher and a really important, one of the most important theorists we have in America today. So you're very fortunate to be able to study with him.
I am, thank you. And thank you for being here. So my question is, though, what would you say your number one, like kind of your most salient criticism of his theory for explaining Russia's behavior, especially with the NATO expansion and whatnot?
Yeah. Well, there's a normative piece and a theoretical piece, right? So, and let me just remind you, is John here, by the way? Good. Then I can say that I can be more even blunter. So realists fancy themselves as theorists, but they're also ideologues. Ideologues. Notice the word I'm choosing, right? They like to say they have this abstract theory, and the liberals, like me, or if you're in the Republican Party, then you're a neocon. We're all about norms. But actually, realism, there's a lot of embedded norms in that theory, right? And one of those norms is that great powers get to choose what other countries get to do. That's a normative statement that is not based on theory. That's based on a way you see the world. And I have a normative disagreement with that assertion. I believe that countries should get to choose who they ally with. And that it's none of Russia's business who Estonia decides they want to enter into a security alliance with. So that's a normative argument between us, and not a theoretical one. Moreover, I believe strongly NATO is a defensive alliance. And you know, if I put an alarm in my house, and you're my neighbor, that alarm is only going to be a problem for you if you are planning to break into my house. If you're not planning to break into my house, my alarm should not threaten you. And by the way, when they say, well, the weapons are right on the border, I'd like to remind you, well, the Russian weapons are right on the border too. You know, a lot of Russian weapons are right on the border. And by the way, they're faster and more, the more of them, and a greater capability than anything on the other side. So their alarm system looks pretty threatening if you're sitting in Tallinn as well. So that's on the normative side. The theoretical piece is, you know, basically the argument, for those who don't know, realism, and there's lots of varieties. These are offensive and defensive, but let's keep it simple for now. I actually gave a whole lecture about this at Stanford 2 days ago. I'll tweet out the link and you can see the full argument, okay? But the short piece is this. Countries rise, countries become more powerful, other countries become weaker, and lines get drawn, and that's the nature of politics, right? And so John's argument is that what you see now, that's just normal. That's the way history has been for 1,000 years. And in my talk, I use a map of 1,000 years of history that you know, as in honor of people like John, to say that it explains a lot in the past. But I can think of anomalies to that. So why is it that the borders around Germany are not being redrawn right now? From a realist argument, you've got to explain that. Germany's way more powerful today in 1945. We should expect conflict. In fact, go back and read John Mearsheimer's article, not lately, but 1990. Go back and see it in International Security. That's exactly what he predicted, and it didn't happen. There wasn't balance of power politics within Europe. I think it was called return to history. It didn't happen. Well, you got to explain that. I have an explanation for it. Regimes matter. It's a democratic regime embedded in liberal institutions. It's shaky now, but that's part of the thing that he can explain from that theory. And so I don't want to say but my theory, the liberal side, explains everything. I think part of the problem with this debate in academia is that you've got to be in one camp or the other. I actually had this debate with Obama one time in August 2008. Exactly this debate. And he said to me, this is on Obama 1. It was right after Russia had invaded Georgia, so I was flown in to brief him. It was actually the first time I met David Axelrod. We were on the plane together. Axe couldn't believe how much time we were spending on all this stuff, by the way. He was trying to win an election. It's like, we really have to have this theoretical thing, but Obama was really into it. And at the end of it, you know, we're landing. I remember we flew from Southern California. We're landing into Reno, Nevada. And at the end of it, he said, come on, man. Obviously, the real world is a mix of these things, and this cartoonization of how the world works is wrong. And I guess I would put myself in the Obamaism in that matter. But great question. Thanks for asking.
And it must be even harder if you're an academic where you have camps and then you cross into the political sphere where there are other camps.
There
and
it
everything you say is
Yes.
filtered through that.
Yes.
All right, next question.
Hi, I'm Katrina, Russian and East European Studies student. Thank you so much for
Excellent.
being here.
We need more of
Yay.
you. Thank you for doing that. Our country
Thank
needs
you.
you.
My question is, Putin obviously claims a privileged sphere of influence in the former Soviet space.
Yes.
As ambassador, did you feel like you were by extension a sort of ambassador to the entire post-Soviet space? And if so, what was your relationship to other post-Soviet countries?
Well, I'm glad you raised that because that phrase originally was coined by Medvedev. And I remember it vividly. It was during the transition. So I was still out at Stanford and it broke. And I think the president-elect had already used the word reset because he definitely used it in the transition. I can't exactly remember the timing. And right away, we were getting hammered for our naivete about Russia. And he used that phrase. I'm sure Putin used it as well. But it's a good way for me to take another bite at the apple of Medvedev versus Putin, because the first meeting that Obama had with Medvedev, it was in April 2009 in London, we actually had a big debate about that phrase. And you didn't read about it because we didn't read it out to the press because we didn't know how it was going to go. But as a result of that phrase, literally like 2 or 3 weeks into my time working at the National Security Council, the president of Kyrgyzstan came to Russia, met with Prime Minister Putin, was pledged a $2 billion economic assistance package I one time characterized it somewhat differently and got into a lot of trouble. That's in the book. But precisely to assert that that was their privileged sphere of influence, and the tit for tat for that was they had to close our air base in Kyrgyzstan, Manaz Air Base. And by the way, I remember sitting in the situation room. It's like, we're in transition, right? We're still trying to like figure out our jobs, and it's like, well, who's in charge of Central Asia? And we're like looking around the room, and oh, that's in the central region of the Central Directorate, which included everything from Iran to India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and like glued onto it was Central Asia. And that was the day that it was handed to me to give it more attention. And my job was to keep Manaz open. I remember very vividly sitting there with some very senior generals. Your job, young man, keep that air base open, because that air base, 95% of our soldiers were flying in and out of Manaz at the time. So we sat down with Medvedev, and Obama played the kind of new kid on the block stories. Like, you know, I'm new to all this diplomacy stuff, but I don't really get this phrase, privileged sphere of influence, that you're using. This is the 21st century. Like, things are moving around all the time. Geography matters that much. And he said, you know what we're doing in Manaz? And I'm going to cartoonize it a little bit and make it blunter. Obama speaks more eloquently than this. But he said they're basically taking hot showers and getting food, hot food, and then they're not like doing regime change in Kyrgyzstan. They're just out at the base. They barely come into Kyrgyzstan. And by the way, I visited Manaz. It felt like you're in Bakersfield. I mean, it didn't feel like you're in Kyrgyzstan. There's a McDonald's there. I mean, you really don't feel like you're in the country at all. And then they get on planes and they go to FOBs, forward operating bases. And what do? They kill people that are terrorists, that are enemies of Russia. So explain to me, why is that not in your interest? Oh, and by the way, you also have $1 billion contract to provide jet fuel to our planes that comes from Gazprom. Tell me why that's not in your interest. And to fast forward, Medvedev believed us. And we ended up having that base work for us for 5 more years. It's when Putin came in that he later closed it, because he thinks in those zero-sum terms. So I didn't answer your question, but that's an important part of the difference between them. My job as ambassador to the rest of the region, none at all. We had other ambassadors in other places. Ironically, I traveled a little bit, but I was mostly, Russia's a big country. I focused my travel mostly there. The only place there was a new ambassador that came in Ukraine. And I'd written about Ukraine before. I'd edited a whole book on it. And his name is Ambassador Pyatt. And when he showed up, we decided that there was not enough communication between our embassy and the embassy in Kiev, and because there's a lot of stuff going on then. And he said we should start some working groups and to fly back and forth. And before the first one got up and running, I think it was planned for December 2013. That's when Maidan happened in November, right before, and so we never actually ended up having those seminars.
You skipped the part about eating eyeballs to keep Manaz open.
Well, I did. I mean, that was that's in the book. So after we went to Moscow in July 2009, yeah, this is part of diplomacy. If you're thinking about a job in the State Department, and if you're learning Russian, you too could go to Kyrgyzstan. We flew out there after Moscow to kind of tell. So this is a part where we're doing it, not as ambassador, but working at the National Security Council. I flew with Bill Burns, the undersecretary, and we're sitting with President Bakiev. This is when I learned about, some days your job, you don't get to just deal with Democrats, you have to deal with autocrats, because Afghanistan's in a pretty rough neighborhood. And we were in a bidding war with Putin, and he sat us down and he said, we're under a lot of pressure, which was code word for, I need more money from you guys. Oh, and by the way, I need money for my son. And the truth is, we were involved in things there that we shouldn't have been. That I think in retrospect were corrupt. And part of that was, to show honor, Burns had to eat the ears. and I had to eat the eyeballs. Yes.
All right. On
Thank
that
you.
note, next question.
Hi there. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Jennifer, and I'm a second-year public policy student here. And so, just to give a little context, there's been a lot of opposition against, Moscow's politics, especially within the Russian people. But Putin has, done a lot of, made a lot of efforts to suppress any opposition against him, and he's made, great efforts to kind of push out anyone who, views things differently than he does. And recently, there have been a lot of protests from the Russian population.
Yep.
So my question is, recently President Trump congratulated Putin on his election, and even before that, President Obama also congratulated Putin on an election.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that say about the U.S. when we legitimize these elections that are clearly unfair? And what are we saying to the Russian people who don't really have that alternative? And in your book, you espouse how we need to fight autocracy, but we're legitimizing, his elections and all these things. So, what would you say about that?
Yeah, it's a hard question, and I struggle with it a lot in the book. So for those of you who are interested, buy the book. I'll tell you what we did, but it didn't end in a good outcome. And I talk about my book being a tragedy because you can talk about all your efforts you want, but if you don't achieve the outcome you're seeking, that's failure. And most certainly, the nature of U.S.-Russian relations today are not what I had hoped for, either as an Obama administration official or as a kid when I first went there. Our strategy was something we called dual-track diplomacy. I stole it from Ronald Reagan and George Shultz. It wasn't an original idea. In fact, it's called, I think it's chapter 27 of Shultz's memoirs, and it's called Re-engaging the Soviets. That's re-engaging, reset, you can see. And we basically just modeled, I tried. Not everybody in the Obama administration agreed with me. Let's be clear about that. I'm just one actor. Not everybody agreed, but that was our strategy. So when we went to Russia with the president in July 2009, we spent the first day with Medvedev, we spent breakfast the next day with Putin, and then we spent the rest of the day, of the second day, with students at Resh, with the business community, with civil society, and we ended the day with a roundtable with opposition leaders. That was Barack Obama did that. That was our policy. That was a policy that had not changed when I showed up as ambassador. Context had changed radically, right? But that was our policy. And that's what we talked about. We always talked about never checking our values at the door, and there were many times when I was there that Obama talked about these kinds of things. He talked about the arrest, the new Khodorkovsky getting another prison term, Lev Ponomaryov, a human rights guy, getting beat up. We talked about them. And with respect to that statement, just compare the statement we made in 2012. It doesn't congratulate Putin. It congratulates the Russian people for voting. And whether that's being too clever by half, fair enough, but we struggled over that statement a lot, precisely to your point that we did not want to give a big high five to that election. And at the same time, after having said all that, I also believe that you have to engage with the leaders of countries when you have mutual interests. You don't get to choose. I had to go talk to Bakiev. In fact, let me tell you a story about Kyrgyzstan. When I went in to do that, a friend of mine at the time was a leader of the opposition. Rosa Atambayeva is her name. And she was mad at me. She's like, "Why are you coming to see this dictator?" And I said, "Well, we got a base we got to keep open." And therefore, I think you don't have to be friends. You don't have to pretend that you have the same values. Those are the mistakes that President Trump is making. But should you engage with Putin on things that are of mutual interest? Yes. I think that's a pretty narrow agenda right now. And I think most of the agenda is more containment. But I do believe in that kind of engagement, not unlike what Ronald Reagan practiced when he was president.
All right. Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Ambassador, I may address you as a colleague. I'm Herbert Queller. I'm representing Germany as Consul General in the Midwest. We overlapped briefly. I served as ambassador in Azerbaijan from 2010 to 2013. So
Oh, wow.
2 years of you being in Washington still, 1 year you being in Moscow.
Great.
And you mentioned what I find, I have to give a disclaimer. I'm both giving my comments and my question in my personal capacity. You mentioned that Medvedev never raised NATO enlargement in talks with you. I nevertheless think that one of the main reasons happened for what you describe, haven't read your book, but what you describe, what you've been talking about, happened just prior to Obama's election, 27 Budapest summit
Yes.
and Georgia. I see that as a crucial event because that touched for the first time, as I see it, the post-Soviet space.
Right.
Directly, and I think that triggered a lot of things that you could then, with reset or whatever, not remedy. So that's the comment. The question that I have: if our governments, Western governments, were able to control or put enough pressure on the World Soccer Association, FIFA. Would you plead for a boycott of the soccer championship in Russia?
Yeah. So
Wait, let's do both questions and
good
you
idea.
can answer
them
both.
all together. Yeah, I should
Okay.
have brought a pen. Good. That's a very good idea.
Sure. First, I want to happy to see Julia, with whom we live in Moscow, the same apartment building for some time. Yes. It was last century, actually, not this one. I have a couple short questions about Putin. First thing, I disagree that he is occasional figure who was from obscurity crime. He is the most talented thug who was selected by Yeltsin because he was the most talented. And then he showed that it was correct selection because he was very, very efficient in his actions. So it's not it. So the first question is: do you think that after Yeltsin, anybody will put Russia in the same route that Putin put?
Okay.
And second question is: in 2002, Putin put Khodorkovsky to prison.
2003. Yeah.
2003.
October.
And it was harbinger of annexion of Ukraine, basically. So United States knows that they deal with the thug. However, they all the time telling us that it's okay. We have geopolitical...
What is the question?
Yeah, the question is it correct position to deal with the thug that you know he is a thug already? You're not thinking that he may be.
Yeah.
To deal with him like with normal leader.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. I'm going to take these in slightly different order, okay? Because I want to end on a positive note. First of all, to NATO and Georgia, we just disagree. You're wrong about that. Georgia ended the debate about NATO expansion in a very thuggish way, but after that happened, nobody in Brussels, I was there, I was at all these meetings, nobody said we should be extending NATO to Georgia. Putin accomplished what he wanted. And it was not an issue because he accomplished what he wanted. He won. Let's admit it. And Germany, you know, Bucharest was a huge mess of all these kind of different signals. But after August 2008, nobody was advocating for Georgian membership into NATO, and therefore it wasn't on the agenda. And to say that that was the beginning of confrontation, you've got to have a theory for all those positive things I described. And in my slide deck that when I give this talk, we go from 17% approval rating to 60 in 2 years in Russia. So Russians don't agree with that either. We were in you just got to remember that history. This determinism, because we know where we're at now, you've got to be able to explain these other periods. As a social scientist, you've got to be able to explain continuity and change and not just see continuity. Our critics argue the exact opposite. It's because we gave in to the Russians on Georgia, and your country too, by the way. You know, when you talk to Saakashvili, because I was there with Saakashvili in September 2009, when the vice president went to see him to basically said, not even NATO membership, we're talking about a map. We weren't even allow them to sign up for a map. And lethal weapons still hasn't happened. So that issue for me was resolved. So you've got to, you know, that's on that one. On soccer, here's what I believe firmly. Have the athletes play, but people like us don't have to show up and stand and be there in the stands. I was at Sochi. I represented our country. I had a fabulous time, by the way. It was a fantastic game. You know, for $50 billion, you should get something. It was a great show. But that's the politicization of sports. Who shows up to be with Putin. That's the act that politicizes what should just be football matches, right? So my view would be, let's just stop with the delegations and let's all agree to it. And by the way, save the taxpayers a lot of money. You paid for me, you know, to people to fly over in jets to do that. Let's just, you know, let the sport fans go. You don't need diplomats there. You don't need chancellors there. You don't need prime ministers there. On Putin and his thuggishness, you know, just to be clear, my views on Putin have been documented for a long time. I wrote my first piece about Putin's thuggishness in March 2000. Go look it up, called Indifferent to Democracy. Nobody should be confused about my views or Obama's views. This notion that we were naive about Putin, I just have to beg to differ, and I think the history is pretty clear on that. Why do you think I'm banned from going to Russia? The only ambassador since George Kennan to be banned from Russia, maybe because Putin understands my views about him, okay? But I want to say three things about, and to close on this. One, you're right that an incapacitated Yeltsin and his daughter and his son-in-law and Boris Berezovsky chose him not to create autocracy, they didn't want that, but to protect their property rights. That was what was on their mind when that happened. By the way, whether Yeltsin had his full capacity is another question. I'm not sure he did, but that was done. But let's just be clear, they weren't doing that saznatana on purpose, because guess what happens to Berezovsky? You know what happens to Berezovsky. If they were so brilliant about that, why did he end up in London? That was definitely not the game plan. They had a different plan that we're just going to preserve the corrupt thing that they happened, and that didn't happen. Number two, the thuggish thing about dealing with Putin. Like I said, you got to deal with thugs in diplomacy. I used to have this argument with my friend Carl Gershman. He runs the National Endowment for Democracy. And you know, I used to go to all their meetings and the World Movement for Democracy I used to attend. And Carl has one of the greatest jobs in the world, because he gets to wake up every day, and his job is to engage with some of the bravest people on the planet. He doesn't have to deal with Manas. He doesn't have to deal with Iran trying to get a nuclear weapon. He doesn't have to deal with opening up a train route through Uzbekistan. I had to deal with Karimov, because you can't get to Afghanistan without going through Uzbekistan. So that's part of diplomacy. You have to do that from time to time. But you don't, as I said before, to talk about people in ways. Nobody does any favors in diplomacy, by the way. The notion that I'm going to talk nice to Putin, he's going to cut me a favor, I never saw that for a minute. You just got to deal when your interests are at stake. And that gets me to the last thing about Putin being chosen for the reasons he was, because it was all ordained. And I've already talked about that. I don't think that. My book is about contingency. My book is about what ifs. I don't see this line straight with Russian history. And most certainly the 35 years I lived through it, it wasn't a straight line. There was contingency. But I want to just bring in Russian society for a moment, because I think after 18 years of Putinism, we have these grand theories about what all Russians think. And I'm going to end on one. Can I have 2 points? Okay.
It's your show.
You're in charge.
You're
in charge. I'm going to say one thing as a professor, and then one anecdote as ambassador, okay? My professorial hat, back to this cultural thing that we're talking about. I actually don't think Russia is as unique a country as some people think it is. I don't believe that. I love Russia. I've spent a lot of my grown-up life there. I've lived in Russia 6 or 7 years of my life, right? I'm a big fan of Russian culture and history, and some of my deepest personal relationships are with Russians. But this notion that somehow Russia's so different that they're going to be outside of more general trends, I don't believe. And one of the trends we know in world about things is as countries become more developed, there is a demand for more open societies. There's a correlation of the richest countries without oil are also the democracies. The only one that makes the list is Hong Kong. And that's hundreds of years of history, which we do not have time. We're at 30 seconds to go through. Read the book. And I just don't think Russia's going to beat that. I think those same sociological, socioeconomic pressures are there. They emerged in the 80s. I think they emerged again in December 2011. The creative class was there demanding that. And I think Russia is going to be like those other countries. That's the first thing. The second thing, I'll just end on an anecdote. We haven't told this anecdote, right? Because I just did this podcast, so it's all blurring in my head. I was talking to about going to a high-tech firm. That was with Axelrod. Okay. I'm repeating myself. I've been talking so much lately on this book tour. So I was ambassador. By the way, being ambassador is awesome. If anybody comes up to you and say, hey, would you like to be ambassador? Take it. Because we've been talking about some of the negative things, but man, like to have as your job, you're obligated to go to the Bolshoi and see the Nutcracker in the front row. That was part of my job. You're obligated to host Herbie Hancock at your house with 600 guests. That was my job. You're obligated to have the NBA come to your house. And NBA stars. For my boys, that was way more important than Herbie Hancock. That's part of your job. It was a fantastic job to do all these different dimensions. And I loved it. I loved riding around in that big black car with that flag on it. By the way, 2 more anecdotes. I'm sorry I'm going on. But we had an argument back when they were hammering me and there were death threats against me. One of my bodyguards said, you know, I think we should take the flag down so we can be a little more unobtrusive here driving around so people won't know who we are. And I looked at Sergei, I was like, we got this giant black Cadillac and these 2 giant Suburbans, and we're riding around Moscow. You think they don't know who we are? Come on, man. We're going to put that flag there because I was proud to have that flag there. And by the way, lots of Russians like to take my photo with that flag there. Remember that when you think that they hate us. All right, last story. One of my jobs was to go around to meet Russian business people. And all these oligarchs you've been reading about, part of my job was to meet with Viktor Vekselberg and Oleg Deripaska and Mikhail Prokhorov, et cetera. We don't have time to talk about all those guys. But one day I was at a high-tech firm, and I'm not going to name it because I don't want to get them in trouble. But it was after the May 6, 2012 demonstrations, which you'll remember well. That's when there had been violence. People were arrested. Some are still in jail today. And I asked in the room, how many of you had been to that demonstration? Almost everybody raised their hand. The creative class, right? These are engineers. By the way, exactly like what you would encounter at Google or Twitter or Facebook where I live. The culture, the bean bags, the free food, they looked and acted. And by the way, we had a lot of Russians in Silicon Valley. So it felt very, this notion that we're different, it didn't feel so different to me. It felt very natural place. And then there was some other thing happening later. I can't remember, Ring Road with ribbons, white ribbons, or some new protest after that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But I asked the crowd, well, how many are planning to go?
Occupy a Buy?
Maybe. It blurs in my head. Okay. Now that you've asked me, I'm going to go figure it out.
Okay, sorry.
So I asked the same question. And only 3 young men raised their hands, right? Very different reaction. And I must have expressed some kind of surprise on my face. I didn't say anything. It was even kind of touchy to be talking about this. But a young woman said, Mr. Ambassador, you're misinterpreting what you're seeing here. She said to me, I'm not going to be there. I didn't raise my hand. But here's why. I'm an engineer. I have 2 children. I'm the breadwinner in my family. You know, she didn't say something like this, but my no good for nothing husband, he couldn't take care of my kids if I went to jail. She made some allusions to the husband that wasn't really pulling his weight, which you're going to write about in your book.
Yes.
Yes. But she said to me, but don't think for a minute that I've changed my mind about Putin because I'm not willing to be arrested. I can't afford it now, but my preferences haven't changed. And I just want to leave you with that anecdote, that when you read that he wins with 77% approval rating and everybody loves Putin, you know, it's like Obama used to complain about this all the time. He would always read in everybody's approval ratings when we would travel, and he's reading Putin's, and he's like, well, yeah, if I controlled all the television and the Congress was mine, I would be at 70% too. And by the way, it's pretty, you know, how you gather that information is kind of monitored. But, and by the way, with no competition, you know, my 9th grade basketball son's team playing the Warriors, it looks like a basketball game and it looks like competition, but it's not really competition. I mean, give me a break. So just remember that with all that circus that Putin goes through to convince you of that, remember that young woman. Remember the 12-year-olds that were just arrested 2 weeks ago. Remember the 85 people in Yakutsk who were arrested just 2 weeks ago, when it's really dangerous to be out doing that. And you know, these hidden preferences I think are there, and it makes me optimistic about the long run in Russia. I just don't know when the long run begins in Russia. And on that, where I am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That was great.